Supported by Відродження Charitable Foundation, with support of Media Center of Reforms. We'll talk to Dmytro Shymkiv, Presidential Administrative Deputy Chief, who presented yesterday Strategy of Reforms, Strategy 2020, and now he speaks in Ukrainian Media Crisis Center. Dmytro, welcome, dear ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to greet you. On Thursday, President formulated the vision for Ukraine that was presented at press conference yesterday. We had detailed discussion of the vision, 2020 vision for the nation. Every nation needs a vision because this is something that unites people. This is something that allows everyone moving in the same direction, following the same vector. President defined that our vector is European standards of life and worthy position for Ukraine in the world. 4 different directions. Vector of development, economic reforms included. Vector of safety and security, which includes reform of defense, reform of healthcare. Sorry, not healthcare, but reform of supremacy of the law, anti-corruption reforms, and law enforcement reforms, as well as judicial reform. This is not just safety of the nation, but also people and business. Then we are talking about responsibility and social protection, social reform, decentralization, and social aspects. And 4th is Ukrainian culture, science, Ukrainian dignity to be promoted in the world. In order to reach this, much must be done in order to fulfill the requirements of European Union, and that is 35 criteria, and each point of 35 is a new reform. When we talk about reform of defense, this is what we need, although it's not a complete requirement of European Union. We talk about question of culture, which was not touched on previous strategies. We need to have clear understanding what cultural reforms must be done to promote Ukraine in the world. We defined the number of reforms, 62 of them altogether. And this is reality. This is reality that we must create. We cannot make all 62 because we don't have enough resource. And majority of reforms must be complete. And first 10 of them are already named. They define the basis for following reforms. We cannot reform the national finance system or agri sector without solving the issues of supremacy of the law, anti-corruption, judicial reform, law enforcement reform, and so forth. These 8 reforms, 2 programs, 8 reforms: renewal of governance, anti-corruption, judicial reform, law enforcement reform, national security and defense system reform, decentralization reform. We talk about governance. We talk about deregulation and development of entrepreneurship, which is important to introduce more investment to Ukraine. Investors are talking about 2 problems. One is corruption and supremacy of the law, and second is deregulation. These 2 criteria we must reach to achieve attractiveness of investment into Ukrainian economy. Then we talk about law and the healthcare reform and tax reform. 2 programs: energy independence, to change monopoly position of any supplier of energy commodities at Ukrainian market. And second is promotion of Ukraine in the world is another vital aspect. We are known in the world by difficult situations that happen in Ukraine. We are known as a country of revolution of dignity, but we need to popularize Ukraine as a country worth investing in, as a country that has very interesting resources, human resources, people that again have are the important element of Strategy 2020. We talk about the battle for talent and the program of attracting talents to Ukraine, development of talents. This is another important area that is mentioned in the program. But reform is just an instrument, because reforms can be done and movement can be done moving towards Russia or some other misunderstood concept that we talk about. We're talking about European and pro-European reforms to define clear indicators, 21 indicator that define the development of the nation and society by 2020. And when we talk about 21 indicators, these 21 indicators allow us to define the state of the nation in 2020. By using these indicators, we can model what indicators should be demonstrated in in 2 years, and this planning is happening right now. When we talk about reforms, we must understand that Strategy 2020 must be uniting for the whole nation. It doesn't respond to the question how, it responds to the question where. Where do we want to go and what result we want to achieve. So we have 3 to 5 versions, variants to introduce every reform. And regardless whether we take one country or any other, we can say that reform of law enforcement in Georgia would be different from law enforcement reform in Slovakia, and the reform in Poland would be different from Baltic states. They have some common ground, some common results, but they are different by the ways of implementation, saying that there will be a certain strategy that is forced from the top down. That would not be reasonable, because we thought that Maidan, for every idea to be heard, for general society to be heard, for dialogue to be started, how we can reform our country. So our dialogue should be open. Of course, there are steps that must be taken in the near future. Certain legislative initiatives, new parliament, new government, for fast implementation of primary reforms. But then we need to understand there is a difference between strategy and tactics. Today we defined strategy, but we are working on tactical steps as well. And these tactical steps should help us reach strategic goals. But without strategic goals, it's hard to move ahead. To conclude, I'd like to say that for that purpose, we're talking about new social agreement between the government, civil society, and business, so that together we'd be responsible for what kind of Ukraine we will have. This is our general vision, and now I'll be glad to answer your questions if there are any, because I believe yesterday, just one more thing. Yesterday there was a presentation of the Strategy 2020 and its discussion in Kyiv Mohyla Academy. We had more than 250 experts that participated in the discussion. Personally, more than 4,960 people participated in online discussion. It was very interesting to have support, critique. It was great, because over many years the strategies were written for our country by some companies paid by some money, but this strategy was developed by Ukrainians. Many experts, so Ukrainian experts, international experts participated, that shared their ideas, impressions, and helped form the vision for Ukraine. That would be all. And I have a practical question. Where can I study this strategy in detail? Is it at the website of administration or not? At this time, we have started a website, Reforms in UA. now is just high-level review of the strategy, but then we'll keep on. By the end of this week, um, we'll publish a booklet, brochure, how it's presented in the rest of the world. New Zealand has one of the best strategies based on sustainable development, and we studied 19 top and 19 bottom strategies of development. The best strategies are adaptive strategies that change, that include the developing situation in the world. Now we are in the beginning, in the very beginning. In this stage is called leadership. Then the planning process is scheduled, and then monitoring, and then adjustment. So this is normal process. In addition, strategical tasks, there are tactical tasks, and we are working on both strategy and tactics. In more detail will be presented later. We're doing everything online. Everything will be open, and by the end of the week, we'll be able to announce the existence of working groups that will work in every direction, who will be responsible. We'll invite also the general public, but we just recently had a meeting with international experts that are asking us about coordination, about what we offer. But we do offer coordination. In no way we're saying that our presidential administration will write down all reforms. Reforms must be developed by society altogether. And these working groups would develop the tactics. Yes, what you presented is a framework strategy. Yes, they must develop strategy, but tactical foundations will be built in view of expected strategic result. If you build a house or if you repair an apartment, you will not begin your work with certain assignments. You will first imagine what result you want to achieve. And after you describe the result, we make a list of work to be done. When we make a list of works, we make the schedule of implementation. So there are elements of strategy and tactics. But if we make tactical things that are not related to the strategy, or if we make a too long list, for example, we receive the strategies of reform suggestions, and in some strategies, some models have, for example, would have 60 types of activities that must be done on every specific reform. But 40% of those suggestions have no relation to the expected result. So if we cut them down, we'll spend less a more optimal result. So something tactical. Every tactical task should be bringing us closer to results. More questions? I have two questions. First question. Strategies are good, and it's great to keep in mind our goals, but there is cabinet of ministers that will implement a specific work. After elections, the cabinet can change dramatically. Do you consider those risks? Or what will happen? Because some reforms or beginning of reforms could be hindered or blocked. Second question relates to data and indicators in the strategy. The goals are 5% for 5% of GDP for military and defense. Who will pay? Where shall we find such money? Thank you for this question. Everyone likes to refer to NATO, but applying to NATO and to become part of NATO are two different things. This is a certain process that today shows that Ukrainian army does not correspond to NATO standards, and this refurbishment will require certain changes in a certain time. Just look at the history of those countries who have entered NATO, how much money and resources they've spent in peaceful time to meet the required standards. So if tomorrow we make application to join NATO, it doesn't mean that NATO will accept us tomorrow. It will take some time.
We will have certain action plan in order to become NATO members. This is number one. Number two, in all that time we will be in a status, rather to say, when the entire country will be under threat, like the majority of countries having northern neighboring country aggressively inclined, means Northern Korea, Singapore, Israel, Turkey. If we understand the level of military development of such countries, they have a rather mobilized army, developed army, and by the way, in the majority of countries around the world, technological development starts with militaries, because GPS, internet, and mobile or cell communication, everything been invented for army purposes. And this is kind of a stimuli for development of powerful army. Unfortunately, the army is usually be spoken in definition of, say, destroy, in definition of destructuring, but what about creation? Because we're speaking about 5%, we're speaking about 5% not tomorrow, but and not in 2015, we're speaking about 2020, because in order to have mobilized, contemporary, and well-organized army, then we must have these 5%. If we are NATO members, then it would be less than 5%. But we will have to protect our country at the same time. In European countries, the share is much lower, but at the same time, we should understand that there's a system of common security for EU member states, and there's a guarantee of security, a guarantee of safety in EU. Not very fast will be the process for us to access NATO. What about financing or funding? We're speaking about the state budget, the support from the USA, a majority of world organizations that could give us certain grants, but those grants should not be spent on the military complex. So partly it must be covered with the state budget. I am ready to make a more detailed discussion in that. Questions on the Cabinet of Ministers. We are considering the indicators. All the indicators are the same as for European country. I have a lot of doubts that the new Cabinet of Ministers would say that we are not now trying to make accession to EU, because all the indicators we introduce, all the indicators are the same as for any European country. Good afternoon, Interfax Ukraine. Several questions. The first one is, you mentioned that in the beginning there should be a reformation of court system, law court system, judicial system. Unless we have this, we won't be able to do something. It doesn't mean that we do not do anything. We are speaking about the Ministry of Culture. For instance, as an example, they have a lot of changes. Ministry of Youth and Athletic. Everything is started, but the entire energy should be pumped into the priorities. until 2020, you hope that the normal judicial system will be in place. Because we have the same judges, the judges should not be reconsidered. But your question, how quick the most prioritized reform be introduced is, of course, in order for our expectation. Our expectations are that reforms or changes must take place as certain steps. First of all, the concept of reforms. Secondly, the concept must be discussed with a broad public. Third, there should be the legislative initiatives, and we may, all those stages, we may accelerate them. But this is a process, and we must do certain steps one by one. Our expectations that we must do these steps very quickly until the end of the year. There should be new parliament, new steps, new moves towards changes. As for judicial reform, I believe that Mr. Filatov from the administration of President is responsible for that. And my task is the generic strategic understanding as well as assistance in coordination of strategic steps. I'm speaking about responsibility. First, second, third. Is there any priorities? No, we are just speaking of a list. Yes, I understand that because constitutional reform is for certain reason is number 4. No, it's not prioritized. Union, Belarus. Dmitry, I have more topical issue. 3G in Ukraine. Cabinet of Ministers until now hasn't yet published any document that contains 3G tender. At the same time, Prime Minister Mr. Yatsenyuk already claimed that no companies based on Russian capital could have access to this tender, and this is MTS and Kyivstar that are the biggest player on the market. Means that the license could not be awarded to such companies. Thank you for your question. This issue is under my control on daily basis, and unfortunately we do not yet have the finalized resolution. At present, for some reasons, the Cabinet of Ministers understands it as it should only determine certain parameters. We have National Security Council responsibilities, and we have certain doubts. Means that it is somebody could have benefit from this red tape, and the operators, they are ready to take part in the tender. They are ready to pay the initial fees that could travel to state budget. So now the responsibility is being taken by the Cabinet of Ministers for all that process. We have our constitution that has been changed. We have responsibility, or say, responsibility and powers of the Cabinet of Ministers, of the President, and it should be a resolution of the government. The resolution should not contain any lines, any provisions that are not supported by legislation. Means the ownership, the sanctions, etc. Everything should be based on Ukrainian legislation, and all the governmental agencies, they must act in the margins of constitution and powers that is granted by the Ukrainian legislation. Thank you for your presentation. I believe that my question will be the most important, as well as your answer will be important. But everything finally being ended in not doing anything. I believe that this is a mandate for reforms and reformation, and if any minister comes and understands that he must liquidate the licensing system for business and transform it into a registration type system, there's a dead end, because everything is ended up in regulations. Because if any civil servant has a mandate to change any policy, if he has a mandate for institutional changes, then he will have different understanding, different position, different way of behavior. Yes, the question is a question of mandate powers. At present, we are trying to coordinate a lot of efforts, concentrated in different groups and structures. As an example, reformation of state civil service, and there is responsibility of Vladimir Groisman at present, and we presented last Friday. It was a big discussion around a new law on civil service. The public, the government, and NGOs took part in that discussion. We are trying to understand what is going on in one group, trying to make that some other group knows about this. We are speaking about information exchange between on information on certain developments. The reformators of Ukraine should keep all that knowledge with them, and we are asking them now to share it with broad public, because some ideas or concepts that were developed several years ago, they would not work now, because the society has changed, and probably many countries around the world, they have certain, considerations. And Ukraine, we are speaking about the maximum involvement of broad public in that. So I understand that the role of administration and president is visionary and coordinative. The cabinet of ministers should be non-politically inclined or in-political, and it must be concentrated on executive power efforts. So many things could be done practically if there's a will. Kiev Post question from Kiev Post. You've mentioned the list of number one draft laws. Could you please list them in sense of that are related to reforms? To what extent your plan of reforms is correlated with Yatsenuk's plans of reforms? Okay.
According to Mr. Yatsenyuk, he plans the Cabinet of Ministers program for a year. This is a level of operational planning. President plans involves community to make long-term planning. He plans in big directions, in longer-term strategy. So, plan of Cabinet of Ministers is fully in line with Strategy 2020. Maybe in some parts of it we might disagree a bit, talking about taxation reforms, but it's just more grounds for discussion. Some things are happening without sufficient discussion. Some discussions were organized by Igor Belus, but then they disappeared after the document went to Ministry of Finance. And then suddenly it appeared. So with this great example, there is taxation reform. We've seen three versions that compete, and that's good. That's normal to have several options, but in all three options there was no discussion. For some reason, public discussion, or not enough. Because the discussion should happen not just with community, but with business association, with business who will pay taxes, and we need to find compromise how to fill the budget. So this is another example of why public involvement, public discussion is so important. So I don't see in this plan, tactical plan, let's just separate these plans, tactical as plans and strategic plans. Tactical plan for a year of this government, that's good, it exists. It lists things to be done in a good manner, and they are part of a real plan. They must be done before end of 2014. Most of those initiatives, and they are included there, and our people are working in the same groups. So I'd like to have understanding here. There is no difference. Some people want to oppose these teams, but there is no real contradiction in operative plan. Cabinet of Ministers and their plan works with strategic view of the president. Would be interesting to see some tactical results, as president suggests, but that's additional work, and I'm sure that the government has seen and received the document, at least the Prime Minister did, about our vision of intended indicators. And these indicators should be seen in work of the government, for example, increasing credit rating of the nation, increasing GDP, decreasing of national budget, national loans, indebtedness compared to GDP. Today we have 1% of GDP for military. We'd like to see that increased. About the draft laws. The draft laws for every vector is prepared. Anti-Corruption Bureau, I hope it will be voted on in this cadency. Some initiatives of tax reform, and I hope they will be discussed wider. Changes should be introduced. State service, decentralization, and other additional laws that I will not list right now, because we need to talk about the complex of events. And also the question of deregulation. I apologize here. There are many changes, and we have a team working to analyze the team that worked with Pavlo Sheremet, and they're developing certain changes that must be implemented. Thank you, and I apologize. Alexander Minichuk, Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Everyone states it's evident and no research is necessary to say that what's happening with Donetsk and what happened with Crimea is the result of absence of humanitarian policy. So how could it happen that after the Maidan of Dignity, Revolution of Dignity, when the whole world says that this is conflict of interest, conflict of worldviews, and humanitarian policy is not part of priority directions? We are not talking about priority directions. We are talking about primary first line of defense. For example, dignity. Let me talk about these reforms, programs of creating brand of Ukraine, popularization of Ukraine in the world, innovations, creation of innovation society, reform of state policy in science and research, tourism and development, space program, state policy, government policy in the area of culture, national cinema production. Is this not culture? Let's differentiate between priorities and first necessary steps. Priorities are most important things. We have not defined the priorities yet. We made the first step. We have listed the first steps to be made. Next question. The program of popularization of Ukraine in the world is a direction that we need it very much. We are building a house without foundation. How can we increase our cooperation with Donetsk? And we had a round table on this issue yesterday. Recent research shows that there is no uniting vector in the reform. Who controls TV? reforms. You will do your reforms, but TV is not controlled. No cinema. No those forums that would consolidate the nation and mobilize a creative community to implement these reforms. So I apologize. But when we look from a side, it looks like reforms are condemned. Thank you for diagnosis. I'm ready to report and carry all responsibility. If not, there are no questions, then I'm thankful to Dmytro, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week, next Tuesday at 1:30. Thank you to